Welcome back, Dram Fam, to episode 3 of the Whisky Diary. Yes, there's been a name change. Go watch the last episode and I explain all of that. When it comes to whiskey, does age really matter? Let me explain. So this week we ask the question, does age really matter when it comes to whiskey? To answer that question, we're going to be exploring sort of 3 core topics. We've got age statement whiskey, no age statement whiskey, and vintage. Age statement whiskey simply means it has a number on the bottle that tells you how old it is. Things like the Bunnahabhain 12 or the Deanston 18. No age statement whiskey, sometimes stylised as NAS, simply means it has no statement on the bottle telling you how old the spirit is. Vintage means it specifies the year that it was distilled and casked. It's then aged, and then you take that with the bottling date, and voila, you can calculate how old the whiskey is. But before we continue, let's get a bit of background. When I first got into whiskey, I was firmly under the belief that older equals better quality. Now, to understand sort of age statement whiskies, you have to understand the concept of aging a whiskey. So what is the age of a whiskey? Specifically with Scotch whiskey, it has to be aged for a minimum of 3 years in an oak barrel in Scotland before it can be considered a Scotch whiskey. For instance, I think with bourbon, it has to be aged for a minimum of 2 years in a virgin oak barrel and has to stay in America for those 2 years, but never mind. Now, once a whiskey has been aged in an oak cask and gets bottled, that's when aging stops. So if a spirit was distilled in 1970, aged for 10 years in an oak barrel in Scotland, and then bottled in 1980, even in 2020, that whiskey is still only 10 years old. As it goes in the bottle, the aging stops. So, age statement whiskey. When we look at a bottle of whiskey and it has a number on the front, that number refers to the youngest spirit that was used to make that bottle of whiskey. Yep, a bottle of Bunnahabhain 12, for instance, could contain spirits of any age from 12 upwards. There could even be some 40 and 50-year-old spirit in there, although probably quite unlikely for cost reasons. But because the youngest whiskey in there is 12 years old, on the bottle they can give it the age statement 12-year-old. It is still considered a single malt whiskey because it's all from one single distillery, but it's blended from the same spirit of different ages. So it's not like it's from different distilleries and stuff like this. Still single malt, still same single malt whiskey, just different ages of it. Without getting into too much detail as to the reasoning why, it's usually they add older whiskies to younger spirit to sort of mellow it out and give some more sort of control over the flavour, to give you a more consistent bottle. And then this brings us to no age statement whiskey. This just means that that bottle can contain whiskies of any age. As I said earlier, to be considered a Scotch whisky, it still has to be aged for a minimum of 3 years. So anything from 3 years and upwards. But Ben, I hear you cry, surely that's just a 3-year-old whisky, and why don't they put that on the bottle? Bloody good question. A no age statement whisky allows blenders to get a little bit more creative with the spirit. You know, they're not constrained to only use a minimum of, say, 12 years old. And some of those younger spirits can have some really interesting sort of wild, pungent, strong flavours. Some of my favourite whiskies back here, such as I've got an independent bottling of a Dram Moor Kalila. It's only 6 years old and I think it's absolutely fantastic. It's a much more sort of raw, wild expression of a Kalila. Now, in a no age statement whisky, the majority of the spirit could be 10, 12, 15, 20 upwards years old. But because the youngest spirit used in it is 3 years old, it cannot be called anything other than a 3-year-old whisky. And so, to some less experienced whiskey drinkers, they might sort of see a 3-year-old and a 12-year-old on a shelf next to each other for almost the same price, and instantly be sort of drawn away from the 3-year-old because of that younger age, when really it could be just as good, if not better, than the 12-year-old. The majority of the spirit in there could be a lot older than 3 years old. Maybe some drinkers might just find that off-putting. Maybe some people feel that it devalues the whisky. So don't put an age statement of it, give it a cool name and done. And lastly, we have vintage. Unlike questionably stylish clothes, vintage doesn't just mean old. When we talk about insert year here, vintage, what we are saying is that all the spirit that's in that bottle was distilled in one single year. For instance, the Isla Barley 2011. That's a 2011 vintage, and that just means that all of the spirit in that bottle was distilled in 2011. What's quite interesting about vintages is when you kind of take the distillation year or the vintage year and the bottling date, you can work out the age of the whisky. Not only that, but it gives a fantastic baseline of kind of comparing the same spirit over several years. Glenrothes, for instance, released some of their 1992 vintage in 2004. That would make it a 12-year-old. And again, they went on to bottle more in 2014, so that would make it a 22-year-old. But they were both still the 1992 vintage. So those two bottlings give you a fantastic comparison of what that extra 10 years has done in the cask, because fundamentally what you've got is the same spirit that's been aged for two different lengths of time. So, does age matter? In my opinion, absolutely not. I think this is becoming more apparent as well with some of the more progressive distilleries and more and more distilleries in general really, releasing more no age statement whiskies. It's showing a trend in the market of people putting less weight on the age and more into the spirit and the flavour and the taste. And I think it's fantastic that it allows those distillers and master blenders in those distilleries to get far more creative with what they're producing. In my experience, even with age statement bottlings, I generally tend to prefer a younger expression of any particular whisky. I have a real taste for that kind of fierce, fresh, spirity flavour of a younger malt, especially in some of the peatier ones, such as the Octomore, for instance, and as I mentioned earlier, the Kalila Dram More indie bottling. It's fantastic because although you can find a lot of complexity in some of those older whiskies, in my opinion, sometimes they don't quite have the same excitement of a younger spirit. But at the end of the day, and with all whisky, it is down to your personal preference. You might have some fantastic 24-plus-year-old whiskies that you absolutely love the mellow complexity of. But for some others, like me, might enjoy that fierce, fiery, fresh spirit flavour. It's up to you, really, to explore and see what you enjoy. But for me personally, my advice would be, just because it's old doesn't mean it's better. And that's enough from me. Thank you all very much for watching. If you'd like to support the channel, please do hit the subscribe button down below and click the bell icon to be notified whenever I upload. And on that note, wait, I didn't even have a dram this whole time. Actually ended up going with the Kalila 6-year-old. Where were we? And on that note, Slajavar.